Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today, braving the heat to be with us here this evening for what will be a fantastic discussion, a very provocative discussion about how we should be thinking about, exploring, reinterpreting the 250th anniversary of Cook's voyage in the Endeavour as he navigated and mapped his way around the east coast of Australia. I'm Larissa Behrendt, and I'd like to open our discussion tonight by a very important and respectful acknowledgement to the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and of course the topic that we're speaking about today, and it being the eve of Australia Day, Invasion Day, Survival Day, makes it especially poignant that we take a moment to reflect upon the generosity with which the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation have shared this land with us, and pay our respects to their elders past and present who continue to be the custodians of the knowledge of this land. As you will know from its prevalence in the festival, that the Eora language continues to be spoken on this country, and I think that's a great symbol for how their connection remains so deep today. So as I said before, I'm Larissa Behrendt. I'm the Chair of Indigenous Research here at UTS, and I'm a board member of Sydney Festival and a council member of UTS. And it's my real privilege to be facilitating the panel today with four Indigenous Australians who I have to say are four people whose work I know and who I really admire. So I can guarantee you I'm as excited as you are to hear what they have to say. Now, we are recording today's event. It will be played on the ABC, on ABC Radio. So if I can ask you to turn your phones to silent, not just because of that, but because you don't want it going off in the middle of the speakers. So with all that out of the way, it's my privilege to introduce the panellists to you. And let's start with Professor John Maynard, who's a Worimi Aboriginal man from the Port Stephens region of New South Wales. He's currently the Professor of Aboriginal History and Director of the Puri Global Indigenous and Diaspora Research Studies Centre at the University of Newcastle. He's a leading Australian historian who's written on a range of Aboriginal histories, including political history, our contribution to the armed conflict, and achievements in sport. Another interesting area of John's research is also the links between African American and Indigenous political thought, and he's particularly shed new light on the Aboriginal political movement of the 1920s around the work of his own grandfather, the leading Aboriginal rights activist Fred Maynard. Then we also, next to John, we have Rachel Perkins, who's an award-winning filmmaker who lives between Alice Springs and Sydney. She's known for her work on the TV series Mystery Road, Redfern Now, the movies Jasper Jones, Brand New Day, Mabo, and other work, including the landmark documentary series First Australians. And I think you'll agree, since I'm sure all of you have seen many of Rachel's works, that this body of work that she's done has made her one of the most significant storytellers in our community today. Stop laughing, Rachel, it's true, it's true.
That's very
She's very modest too.
Yes. Just take
Now,
it.
next to Rachel, I'm really pleased to introduce you to Amrita Hepi, who is an award-winning First Nations choreographer and dancer from Bundjalung country in Australia and from Ngāpuhi in New Zealand. She's worked with leading Australian dance companies Force Majeure, Maraguka and Oakers, and toured work nationally and internationally through theatres and galleries in Australia, Europe and the United States. She's trained at NAISDA and the Alvin Ailey Dance Theatre in New York. Her work, The Ropes, is part of Sydney Festival and really worth a look, and she's one of the most interesting new voices in our community. So welcome to Amrita Hepi. And for the very few of you in the room who don't know the person on the end, it's my pleasure to introduce Wesley Enoch, who's the Artistic Director of Sydney Festival, former Artistic Director of the Queensland Theatre Company, and I think one of the most important voices in Australia's performing arts industry and one of the leading creative thinkers in the country. The way he's ignited Sydney with his direction of the festival over the past couple of years has been truly inspiring and has been a great contribution to the cultural life of the city. So thank you. Well, now you know who everyone is. Let's start off. And I'm going to actually start with John Maynard because John is the historian amongst the panel. And John, I guess what I was going to ask you to have a look at is you have done work around Cook and formed some views about how we should see him. And I was wondering if you just basically share some broad brushstrokes of those thoughts with us.
Yeah, some years back I spoke at the East Coast Encounters at the National Maritime Museum at Darling Harbour, and there was a forum there and there was an exhibition. And I spoke there, and I've also written a brief piece about Cook in regards to that. And I guess in summary, I mean, for us as Aboriginal people, I guess if we wanted a bogeyman to represent everything that's happened to us in this country, I mean, after Cook, I mean, invasion, occupation, dispossession, cultural destruction, segregation, assimilation, stolen generations, everything that has impacted onto us in this country since has a start point, and that is with James Cook. So there's a lot of negatives, certainly, for Aboriginal people in the memory of Cook and what he represents. I think even in the discussion of James Cook, we saw what happened with Stan Grant back in 2017, and Stan going for a walk through Hyde Park comes across the statue of James Cook, and Stan wasn't denigrating the memory of James Cook. He wasn't asking for that statue to be torn down. He just made the observation that it was wrong and saying that James Cook had discovered Australia and wanted an amendment to reflect Aboriginal people who've been here for 65,000 years. And that's an important point. But of course, that unleashed a fury of backlash against Stan Grant at that particular point in time. In saying that, I mean, I go back to my school years. It was in the 50s and 60s, and it was all about the discoverers, the explorers, the settlers, even Bradman as a cricketer and Farlap as a racehorse. But the reality is we weren't in that particular story and that particular narrative. But again, I mean, that East Coast Encounters actually went on to the Endeavour replica down there at Darling Harbour at that time, and it was an incredible piece of maritime achievement to actually get that thing across the globe and come through mountainous seas. It's so small,
yes,
confined, and I mean, I was amazed. You really had to bend down on the lower decks to get around. I wouldn't like to have been on that ship. I mean, today it'd be like going to the moon or to Mars or something, surely, to go to the other side of the world. And I've always liked to look at Cook's observations as well, because he wasn't the norm for the British Navy at that particular time. You had to come from the right family background, you had to come from moneyed background, privileged background. Cook's father was a farm labourer, and he had to work his way up and through that. And for me, his observations were reflective of, you know, doing things more tougher in regards to that. And in Australia, I mean, in his log, I mean, he made the observation that as far as Aboriginal people are concerned, they are far happier than we Europeans. They live in a tranquility undisturbed by the inequality of life. The earth and sea provides them with all the things necessary for life. They live in a warm and temperate climate. They've got a good air to breathe. So he was clearly making these observations. And maybe you've got to look at London and Britain of that time. Raw sewage is running through the streets. Disease is rampant. And to actually rise yourself up, there were a lot of difficulties to get there. Cook was an exception. So he was looking at egalitarian Australia, where everything was about sharing and everybody were looked after. And he had that observation to make, I think, which is an important point to consider as far as Cook's concerned. But the downside to Cook, of course, is, I mean, they were in the Pacific to witness the transit of Venus across the sun in Tahiti, and then he had secret orders. And the secret orders were, after that transit of the sun, was to sail to the south and look for the great southern land, which had been reported as being there. Of course, he did come into New Zealand, where Tasman had been before, and he found that and circumnavigated New Zealand, and then he come across and he bumped into Australia. And he sailed up the entire east coast. Now, his orders were that if, you know, come into contact with people, I mean, this is from the Admiralty and as such from the Crown. He was to open up dialogue and discussion and communication with the natives and gain their consent to open some trading posts for the Crown. Of course, we do know we bumped into a few Aboriginal people up the east coast of Australia, and some of those accounts are telling him as well. And in one instance, he quite clearly said, all they seemed to want from us was to be gone. And you can't be any more blunt than that. But after that, of course, they ran into the Great Barrier Reef. They were lucky to survive, and they spent several weeks up at what is now Cooktown and repaired the ship and sailed further up the east coast and bumped into Possession Island, where what is now Possession Island, where he stamped down the flag and claimed the entire east coast for the Crown. But as I've said, that was against what those orders were in reality. He didn't open up discussion. He didn't gain any consent from Aboriginal people in that respect. So our sovereignty was never given up at that particular point in time.
Thank you. That's a great grounding. Wesley, John obviously highlights a couple of really important things you'll have to grapple with next year as you go into Festival 2020, and that is the fact that for many Australians, Cook's a very revered figure, and there's, I remember the art historian John Mundine sort of saying it, any attempt by Aboriginal artists to in any way denigrate Cook is it's almost like a sacred cow. But then at the same time, as John points out, there's obviously a very strong Indigenous connection, a very strong view about, even if he wasn't the one who first came and set up a colony here, he started it. So as the artistic director of a festival going into 2020, how are you thinking that you might pull all of these threads together?
Well, I mean, the thing for me is that there's the reality of Cook and all the things that the history books will tell us, but the fact that he is now more symbolic than real, that he does not exist as a real person, he exists as a myth, you know, and those kind of mythic qualities are what we should unpack. For me, the conversation in a festival should be about inviting artists to create work that are as much from the people he met along the way. So what does it mean for the people of the Pacific, you know, to talk about this journey? And weirdly, he came the wrong way. You know, when all the winds go the other way, he came this way. And I just go, how do you do that? That's an amazing skill in itself. But the people he met along the way, and I still want to have the Hawaiians come and visit. You know, that would be amazing to see what they do. I know Peter White's in the audience, and he talks about a number of those kind of projects. At the moment, the conversation we're trying to have is very much from the ship viewing the shore. And I think what we need to do is also have the counterpoint, which is from the shore looking at the ship, and so that we can have a balanced view. So what are the things that we're doing? I'm talking to Brooke Andrew, he's also the artistic director of the Sydney Biennale, which runs for this period of time. And we're talking about a project at the moment which, don't tell anyone, but this notion of flag making and how by placing a flag somewhere, you occupy it, you own it, you proclaim ownership, and how that means that you know, anyone can actually create any flag they want and plant it somewhere and say, I own this. But what real depth does that have? So we're looking at a big flag project around that. I'm very interested at the moment about ideas of occupation. The conversations in my head, at least, is to talk to different Pacific nations to come and build a Pacific village somewhere and occupy this land for a period of time to see what conversations can come from that. And this notion of the reenactments drive me spare. Because, it's only on a mythic level that these reenactments occur, not about the realities of things. And that even this kind of, going around the circumnavigation of Australia, you know, a historically inaccurate reenactment drives me spare, because if it is about learning about, you know, what this journey is and what it meant and what the secret orders were, etc., we're not going to do it, because we're only going to stay in the mythic. We're only going to be like this. Noel Pearson has those, and I've said it so often, so please forgive me if I repeat myself to you. Noel Pearson talks about the three narratives of this country. He says, the longest continuous culture on earth, the British colonial project and the institutions we've inherited, and also the most successful multi-ethnic, multicultural nation on earth. And what the Cook anniversary does is start to lift one up in favour of the others, and tries to build, if you like, a kind of competition for airtime. And what I think we should be doing is saying all those three things is our lived experience. We look around the room right now, and those three narratives are being formed, are being reenacted, are being exercised. Just us. Our lived experience is those three narratives. And when we want to kind of, and which is why I'm going to say Australia Day, when we lift the 26th of January up and that anniversary up and only don't want to see the symbolism of that, then I go, oh, that's really problematic. And hence why we've been looking at the vigil to say, well, and this is a big invitation, tonight at dusk until dawn tomorrow, everyone's invited to come to Barangaroo, well, as many people as we can fit are invited to Barangaroo Reserve to sit vigil. And if you like, to build more compassion and understanding for an Indigenous perspective, to say, if we can sit vigil and think, what was it like the day before the arrival of the First Fleet? And we build a compassionate viewpoint, then we actually build a stronger community that can actually have the 26th of January and that anniversary. We can still mark that if we actually understand the stories around it as well. And that's not to do with Cook, but I love that these two things just collide. You know, the politicians who can't work out what happened in 1788 versus 1770. This notion of our nation building is mythical, but so young. And so for me, it's really about getting artists to create projects which are about from the shore looking at the ship.
That's a good point to move to Rachel. Obviously, as Wesley said, we've grown up in a country that had some very big myths and very big narratives, and it's been a fairly recent phenomenon that we have had more profile of Indigenous counter-narratives, Indigenous storytelling. And I was wondering, Rachel, if you could share your reflections on the role of those counter-narratives or Indigenous narratives, and particularly how you use that through your work.
Yeah, I think, Stan looking at those monuments that are littered around Sydney of Captain Cook and noting the exclusion of Indigenous figures from this area, demonstrates the emphasis that we've had on the colonial narrative. And that's been part of nation building that began with settlement and accelerated after Federation and continued on. And so this anniversary is another part of that. Can I say that I think we are more advanced than we've ever been in terms of an inclusive approach to the narrative, but I think that in Australia the colonial narrative still dominates, and Indigenous artists, historians, filmmakers, performers, academics, and our fellow Australians who support and have been engaged in that work as well have been crucial in pushing that narrative forward. In terms of filmmaking, which is what I do, my contribution, this year I just wanted to talk about a project that I'm working on at the moment because it brings into question this whole debate about how we present these narratives. And I think I'm interested in progress and inclusiveness, in my upbringing, in what I believe. And so my filmmaking work aims to bring together rather than separate and divide. So at the moment, but that's a difficult thing, and that's a nuanced approach to narrative making that brings people together because it's so easy. We know how easy it is for people to back into their corners and their own experiences and their own opinions. So, if you want your work to be effective, you want it to cross borders and, speak to a wide audience, not just sit in the silo, although that's much easier to do. So at the moment I'm working on a project called First Wars. The byline is Lest We Remember. So, of course, what we haven't come to terms with in this country, and it's symbolised in Cook, but of course he was just a great navigator and seaman, and his secret instructions, of course, asked for him to get the consent of the natives, but actually the consent of the natives was a mere footnote. What it really was is an expression of sovereignty in relation to other European powers to claim the continent, not to Aboriginal people. That was an expression to the rest of the world that the East Coast or the eastern part of Australia was the Crown. So our issue fundamentally is with the Crown and the state, of which our institutions are still based upon. And of course the conflict in Australia, you can say, it's poetic to say, I think, that Cook, he shot the first bullet in the warfare that would continue across the country in a very complex way over a 150-year period. And that started at Botany Bay, Kamei Botany Bay, and it then swept across the country because of the fact that they would not enter into treaties at that time or acknowledge the sovereignty of Indigenous Australians. So my challenge in telling the story of the first wars, which began with that colonial endeavour, is how to not separate and divide the country, with the presentation of that truth. Because, of course, I have European heritage. I am an Australian of mixed heritage. I do not want to seek to divide, but it is a terrible truth. For instance, in Queensland, 65,000 Aboriginal people lost their lives on the frontier. Those numbers are bigger than the total Australian death rate in the First World War. Now, we have no monuments. We have 2 monuments in Queensland to those warfare. So, in terms of the colonial narrative, in terms of the narratives that shape our country, my challenge and our challenge, I think, is how do we accept those truths that are still very present? We still have, as Henry Reynolds, a great historian, says, you can't hand down guilt, but you can certainly hand down property. So, there's still families who were engaged in this warfare. There's still people who remember it very clearly in oral history. We still have these narratives that we must overcome to be a more mature nation. And I think in Aotearoa, they are more advanced. In other countries, they are more advanced. And the Cook opportunity, if we see it as an opportunity, gives us a moment to look back on our past and think about, how our country was created and try and be inclusive and try not to increase hatred and resentment, which is so easy to do.
In some ways, 1988 is a good example.
Yes.
A lot of the Indigenous performing arts infrastructure was created between 88 and 93. That 5-year period was a fantastic kind of moment for Aboriginal theatre companies and dance companies, etc., that really took off. Why? I think because 88 provided a moment of reflection, a crucible that, things clashed, yes, but also that reflection created a moment of momentum. And if anything, we could actually get that out of the Cook anniversary as well.
I think, I have positive and cynical moments, right? But I think we have to try and suspend our cynicism if we can. And really, in a way, we're sometimes fooling ourselves in that process, because if we look at the bicentennial and our hopes that we had then, we were convinced at that time as we walked through the streets just around here that we would have a treaty. And all these anniversaries, the context, there was 88, then there was 2000, the year 2000, and then there was Federation, 2001, we hoped for something then, and then there was the referendum anniversary, 2017, and now we have the Cook anniversary. And Indigenous people, in their great, what could I say, hope, ambitious optimism, we wait, we hope, and let's hope that this thing gives us some resolution.
Amrita, I might bring you in now, and hopefully you're hopeful. Your work does look at complex and multifaceted identities, and I wonder if you could maybe give us your reflections on the extent to which you think it's possible to even have a united Indigenous view about some of these issues, and how do you see the creativity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their creative practice contributing to the national story?
It's a big, big question. I think I first want to draw attention to the generosity that's already been shared on this panel in relation to answering the questions around Cook, around the voyage, also to not just going into this while we are resisting, while we are fighting for a future where we're more included. I feel that I have to draw attention to the comprehensive answers that everybody has already given in including all of the different perspectives. And I think in continuing what you were saying, Rachel, it's like, I don't think I can call myself an optimist, but I would say that I'm a prisoner of hope. So to be...
Good way of putting it.
But that's actually not my line, that's Cornell West. In terms of complex identities and having, I guess, a united Indigenous view, I guess I want to start with the idea of the fact that I think that there is very, very complex histories that we are advocating for, in this country. And I think that underneath, I guess, whether we want to say it's colonisation, capitalism, underneath these forces, there is a tendency to flatten everything. There is a tendency to flatten everything so that only the hegemonic can arise, so that we can only see a kind of 2D story of a thing. And it can only be presented in this one way, when really, actually, there's a multitude of ways that, Indigenous people could be represented, Cook could be represented, and we are at a point where we need to be reimagining these stories and not flattening them, and not looking for the tropes that are easy to understand in what indigeneity may represent. I'm with you in saying that I want it to be inclusive, and I also want it to have the ability to be innovative, to be able to, go to new heights and new boundaries and to be complex. But I think in doing that, and I think this is what a lot of my peers are really locking into, it's coming into localities. It's working deep into the personal with rigor and respect, and then being able to hope to touch on the universal. And I'm saying this in a way that I'm not presenting a universal view. I'm digging deep into the personal of what I can know, of what I'm trying to know better within this diaspora, in order to present something that I hope that can touch on in a universal perspective. And this is, it's really, I feel like we're always revising and bringing up the fact that it's an exciting time. But I really feel excited by the work that I've seen in this festival, but also to the conversations I'm having with my peers and the people around me. And also to, I guess, in different communities, in different, I feel sometimes, you're kind of you're held to talking about your identity sometimes more than the work, if you're sitting at the intersection of a lot of things. And I think that sometimes, we can get muddled into wanting to have to present political views rather than having to be able to, or being allowed the, I guess, freedom to talk to these stories in order to maybe touch on these in a broader light. So, yeah, I think in terms of a national Indigenous view, I think it's relocating all the localities of the different countries that exist around this big island.
John, going back to the actual Cook narrative, can you share with us some of the ways that we're now seeing, perhaps more broadly in the broader community for the first time, an Indigenous perspective being brought into that conversation?
Yeah, I think that's, and all the speakers have touched on that, of the importance of that. I mean, if we're going to have a shared future and a shared history to look at, I mean, it's got to be inequitable, and that we all actually have a say. I was a keynote speaker recently at the Cook exhibition at the National Library, and they had a forum there. And one of the really telling things, and this touches on to what Wesley was saying with bringing in Hawaiians and Islanders, the speakers at that forum were from Hawaii, Maoris, Tahiti, islands across the Pacific. They were the dominant speakers at that forum, which I just really thought, this is a real important moment here. And it was a great forum, and it certainly changed the dynamic in regards to what was being spoken and how it was being spoken. And it wasn't sort of attacking Cook or anything like that. I think it was a real positive. And I think that's the way certainly to go for the future, not just in Cook, but how we look at our history, that shared approach. And Rachel's touched on that as far as her work is concerned with film. It's got to be more inclusive. I mean, my family, Aboriginal Irish, and also during the war, my grandmother's sister, my auntie, she married a Greek guy who came out here. Our families are so diverse these days. And I mean, that is reflective of what this country is today. And we've got to touch into that. This is not just the Anglo history of the past, it is a shared history right across the board, and it's so diverse today. And we've got to look at and include all of that and give that more broader, inclusive history.
Might just throw in one question that's come through the Twitter feed that does touch on what everyone's been speaking about. But the question was why the negativity is directed at Cook, which should really be directed at the British Crown. I wonder if you had any observations about that, why he's become such a catalyst. And does that really mean the British Crown is off the hook, or is it just another part of the conversation?
Yeah, well, we've got to find a guilty party somewhere, haven't we? Who's to blame? Look, I think for us, and I'm speaking for us, we have to be realistic to say, if it wasn't the British, it was going to be someone. We're not going to be left alone here in regards to what happened. So we've got to look at that. And as I said, Cook certainly became the bogeyman for us. But again, when you look at those secret orders, I mean, it's such a complex area. I mean, you're a legal background. I mean, it's there to say he had to open up conversation and gain consent, but he didn't do that. So, I mean, was he violating the Crown's orders in that respect, to go back to that?
In some respects, though, as I was saying before, Cook isn't the man.
The
you know,
myth.
it's the myth of him. And even now, we've just found Flinders' body.
Underneath the train station.
We found the wreck of the Endeavour and some particles of wood on the bottom of a bay.
Yeah.
And we talk about these as holy kind of objects somehow, when you go, actually, they're just human beings, and they made mistakes, and that's all right. But they get lifted up. I'm still old enough to remember when at school, Cook was absolutely taught as, we learned about Cook as the discoverer, all of that. We talked about Aboriginal and not even Torres Strait Islanders, Aboriginal people as Stone Age and all this stuff. So the mythical qualities of him actually mean we just want to burst the balloon. We just want to go, let a little bit of air out of him. Let him just go, let him just kind of deflate a little so we can deal with the reality of the issues. And I think that's why we want to talk about Cook in that way.
Scott Morrison would be happy with Flinders remaining in the grave, I think, because, I mean, he didn't circumnavigate Australia. Cook did, for goodness sake.
That's right.
Leave him in the ground, Wesley.
I'm surprised it took this long for Scott Morrison to come up, but on this topic. But anyway, actually, Wesley, I want to come back to you about and follow up with something that you touched on earlier, which is how you've started to conceive acknowledging, marking Australia Day. And I think that's been a really interesting thing. The Sydney Festival has always run across Australia Day, and it really wasn't until we had an Indigenous artistic director that it became more controversial about what we were doing. So you were kind of in the spotlight a bit about how you were going to handle what is now a really polarising day, really, sadly. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you handled that, and then a little bit more about now what we're seeing in the festival as part of that conversation.
Well, like the other panellists here, my Filipino family, my Danish family, my Spanish family. It's interesting that Aboriginal Australia, maybe all those who lived on the fringes, found ways of communicating with each other more than those who found themselves in the centre. You talk to lots of non-Indigenous Australians who have a kind of, let's say, an English background. They married into their own a lot, whereas I think there's a lot of kind of cross-fertilisation that happens on the fringes. And I think we're living in an era now where we're in a donut of a society. The centre feels empty, and the natural kind of energy is those from the fringes are finding themselves in the centre because we are articulate about our cultural milieu. We live and breathe it, but we are also analysing it as we're going. So to become the artistic director of the Sydney Festival was, I think, the board. Thank you very much. The board found the conversations more stimulating, that a festival for its city could actually live not just in the what can we pull in from the best of Europe or the best of wherever else, but what are the stories that can come from here and be about here. At the moment, down at the Drama Theatre of the Opera House is Man with the Iron Neck, which is talking about resilience of Aboriginal families facing suicide of young people. Now, you couldn't have, get all funny, just the story of those women, those young women who have taken their lives in just the last few weeks is pretty devastating. And alongside that, there's a narrative of a replica of the Endeavour doing a, inaccurate historical reenactment. These things are so weird. The dissonance is huge. And so for me, I'm more about saying, let's talk about the dissonance. The Australian newspaper actually was saying, I'm going to pick on the Australian, they were saying, this festival lacks oomph, lacks wow, because it didn't have the big opening event. It didn't have the big street parties. It didn't use taxpayers' money to kind of throw more privilege on privilege. We were saying, here are important stories that need to be told. What's been fascinating is that the people of Sydney who maybe have been ignored or starved of that sense of ownership of story or the space have come out in droves. We've had close to 100,000 tickets sold. It's interesting, like one show, which had a very strong Chinese component to it, had 20% of the audience were Chinese singing along with the songs. Where were they a couple of years ago? And it's part of me that goes, we have to remember that this country is no longer dominated by the one narrative. And this sense that as someone who is on the fringes coming to fill your hole, which sounds very bad when you say it like that, it's coming to come into the centre and occupy the centre. We have so much to share that Aboriginal Australia, in this case, can teach you so much more about putting culture in the centre of your society, education being told through song and dance, how narratives can fill you up. So for me, the shows that we're doing around our First Nations brothers and sisters from Canada or from New Zealand, the new playwriting festivals of First Nations, these things are not new. They've been things we've been doing for ages, but now we're putting them in the centre and people are coming because it's filling a hole in themselves in many ways. The dissonance between the Cook narrative in its most simplistic form being expressed, and you can feel it now, the mocking of it. Everyone's going, what's this? It's not us. And the lack of leadership, the lack of providing narratives, there's this sense of the dissonance between the actions of our leaders and the ambitions of our society. You just feel it crashing up against each other all the time. And it's strangely, if our political leaders can't enter into that territory, the artists, the storytellers, we're ready to go.
Now, speaking of storytellers ready to go, Amrita, you've done a lot of work on how we could see colonisation and Cook's Voyage. What are some of your key thoughts around that area? And what are your reflections on the similarities and differences of our worldviews and what with other nations around the world in relation to this? And are there things that you think make us distinctly Australian?
I think most of actually my work, I hadn't actually, I think, really delved as deep into Cook as I have maybe in the last, 3 months with everything that is happening. And while I have definitely spoken about colonisation, I think the thing with Cook is this kind of cultural amnesia that we have, but also to this, and our Prime Minister has said this kind of wanting to protect certain narratives as if they're going away somewhere, as if they're not protected already, as if they're not the history that is already, that most of us sitting in this room were taught in schools. Wanting to really kind of keep that inertia rolling. So it is then, I guess, and I've always, I think in my work it has definitely touched on this kind of the dilemma around authenticity, the realist thing that can emerge. And I think when we're talking about, global, broader narratives, I'll start from speaking from, my family in Aotearoa. When we're talking about that in relation to Australia, in relation to maybe, Canada, one of the broader global narratives, I know we were speaking about this before, Wesley, is connection to the water, protection of the water, cultivation of the water, and really what's happening around, voyages across the water. And I feel like that's one of the bigger, broader themes that I'm seeing in contemporary art making at the moment. But I guess, the thing that really, surprises me in relation to Cook and in relation to where we're at the moment, I guess, is really coming back to that just the total amnesia of what we're trying to represent now, and to keep that, as Wesley was saying, myth alive. But again, and then in terms of how could we, the last part of your question around, what was the last part of your question in regards to Australia?
The things that are distinctly Australian when you look at how other Indigenous people around the world, or even just around the Pacific, think of
Around the
Cook.
Pacific.
Yeah.
I know New Zealand they've had 6 years talking about Cook. 6 years of negotiating what it would mean and the conversations already. Like, we're only just coming to it in the last year or so.
Next year.
Oh, hello.
And I mean, it's funny too with the representation of Māoris around, like, globally. Like, I feel like whenever I'm talking to people, they're always like, they've got it figured out down there, hey. Like, they really know what's going on. They know what's up. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, yeah, in a way, there's these amazing things that are happening, but they're all still entering into the same struggles with incarceration, with their kids still being taken away, with suicide. You know, it's you know, we can't hold them up. Even though I think a lot of people like to,
But
and
that's
they are doing great.
Rachel's point about treaty, though.
Yeah.
You know, where you go, there is a structure. You know, how inadequate it is another story.
In
The
terms
Treaty of Waitangi.
languages. Yeah.
But at least that's a starting point for conversation, which, you know, Cook, Philip, and then in 1835, they robbed us the ability to negotiate what is at least possible.
One of the best, actually, renegotiations of treaty that I have seen, I think, happened in Oklahoma, when they renegotiated a treaty that said, you know, we will provide you with funds as long as, you know, the grass is growing and the river is long, and et cetera, et cetera. But actually, and we will provide you then with earth and mineral rights. And so then the people from Oklahoma actually got to a point in federal recognition where they took that back and actually reinstated that treaty. And actually, instead of completely, you know, mining all of their mineral rights, they've done it in a way that's democratic, and then actually goes back in to serve the First Nations people in that community, which I think is great.
Can I just add a little story? I was talking to some of our Canadian friends who have come over with a show called Dear Woman, and in Six Nations, they have what they call Bread and Cheese Day, which was written into the treaty that they would get a day, every treaty day, they would get $5. And collectively, they now spend that $5 having bread and cheese as a kind of remembrance of what the treaty is. So even now, it's inadequate, but this sense of that it still occupies, and they go up and they go, but where's my chickens and where's the other things that are in the treaty? But they have bread and cheese on a day of remembrance of the treaty.
And how could you be, like, I guess, reinterpreting, like, what is owed, or what is, like, how are we allowed to be speculative and bigger than that in what we're taking back, you know? I think theatre does it quite well, and same with dance.
Speaking of these big picture things like treaties, Rachel, you've been really centrally involved in the national conversations about constitutional recognition, the Uluru Statement, Voice to Parliament and Treaty. How can conversations around Cook provide an opportunity to address some of these issues that you've been working to progress, and what sorts of things would you like to see happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. We had hoped, of course, that the 2017 anniversary would provide some leverage, because we don't have the leverage. You know, we are such a small minority. So how do we get the majority to make structural reform in to our benefit? And so these national moments are points of leverage for us. And mostly they've failed to deliver our aspiration. And talking about days, of course, Benita Mabo, who's passed away recently, her aim was to have Mabo Day, the 3rd of June, recognised, some equivalent acknowledgement of native title, which of course speaks to this challenge we have in our history about colonisation. So at least to have some balance, that you have a day that represents the occupation of our continent by the British, and then the acknowledgement of the High Court of our existing title that remained, So, what was the question? What can we do about the Uluru Statement? Well, of course, we have now a Labor government in May. I'm just saying that's what's going to happen, right? We all know that's going to happen.
Chickens.
I'm not saying how I'm voting. I'm not saying how you should vote. I'm just saying that is the reality, right? Unless, I don't know, Warren Mundine might change the whole thing. You never know. But, good on him, bros. Go for it. But when I say that, they have already promised a referendum on this issue. They have already agreed to set up what we call a Makarrata commission, which will negotiate treaties, whether they are local or global, national. So there is change ahead for the nation. Now, our challenge, I think, as artists and historians and academics and lawyers, is to try and take the nation with us in that process towards that change. And so sometimes I think in failure, like in the rejection of the Uluru Statement by Turnbull and Abbott and Scott Morrison, 3 Prime Ministers have all said no to one of the central aspirations in that. Sometimes out of rejection can come a positive thing because the nation galvanises behind that injustice. So, for example, the Yolngu losing their case for land against Nabalco. Out of that, the Whitlam government introduced land rights legislation. So sometimes out of loss can come change. And I think we've seen let's not be too ambitious, we've seen a small percentage of Australians get behind the aspirations of the Uluru Statement and want to understand that. And let me say that, just briefly, because I don't want to put too much, that comes from a tradition of the Barangaroo Statement, the Yirrkala Bark Petition, the Larrakia Treaty. This is not a new thing. In fact, the aspirations of the Uluru Statement have been repeated over and over and over again in all those various statements and many recommendations in the reconciliation process, and we have not yet achieved them at a federal level. So I think it gives us leverage. But at some point, I'm going to break out of the prison, Hope Prison. Is that the prison?
Break
If it doesn't
out.
happen soon, I'm going to break out of the prison and I'm not going back to the Hope Prison. I'm going to the cynical, bitter, twisted prison where I'm just going to go, I give up.
I'm dragging my chains along in the Hope Prison still. And I mean, no disrespect, but talk is cheap and there's a lot of empty promises in our history. And I mean, if that's the case and the Libs are gone and Labor's coming in, they really need to stand up for what they've said. And I mean, they'll be held accountable if they don't, because as I said, we've had a lot of empty promises in the past.
And let us say, though, we have more Indigenous parliamentarians than at any other time in our nation. So that is a thing of great hope. So we must remember our advancement as well.
So we're all teetering between hope and despair. I'm still on the hope side, thanks guys.
Dragging me chains with me, but I'm there.
There's questions to all of you. I'll ask you individually, and it sort of mirrors a question that's come through the Twitter feed as well, which was sort of asking if we debunk the Cook myth, what is the national myth that's in its place? And I guess I was thinking a similar thing, which is at the heart of these questions about how do we acknowledge Cook's anniversary, what does Australia Day mean, how do we mark it, is that broader question of what sort of country should we be? And here's a real chance for you to give us all some hope about what your vision is for the country, what is your wish for the country. And I might start with you, Amrita, since you're the youngest, so you'll probably have the most time left.
God.
Most time left.
All that moisturiser gone to waste.
I know, we're the same age, Wesley. As you mentioned last year to everyone and announced our age.
The glaring thing that keeps banging on in the back of my head is that you don't spend $6.7 million on a boat to reenactment. Like, that is just like, that's like at the very forefront of my brain. So I'm just going to say that out there. But in terms of like going with Cook or how we're going to incorporate this into our history, or how are we going to, celebrate it. Look, I'm committed, even though I'm going to side with you and say I'm not an optimist, but I am committed to serving certain things. I'm committed to serving, I'm committed to keeping on with thinking about how I can create or make or support others that are making things that would contribute to a broader history. I'm committed to serving and continuing to learn about how to serve others as a custodian. What I'm not committed to serving is a singular colonial history about a boat circling our country. That is what I'm not committed to serving. So, I'd like to continue to be in service until I'm back into the prison of hope.
What about you, Wesley? When you think of what your ideal Australia would be, what are some of the ideas you have for that?
Yeah.
What do you hope for the country?
I think that the biggest thing for me is the denial that comes from fear. That what we're doing often is because of fearfulness, and Eva Cox is here, and one of the big things for me when the Boyer lectures came out and talked about social capital and the loss of social capital, which is now, we're talking that those lectures were years ago, and we've seen this kind of our social infrastructure be frayed and privatised, and we've become algorithmically tribal through social media, and that we are fearful of others in a way that I just don't understand. Because we lack things that we hold on to. And that forms a kind of denial of other people's experiences, other ways of being. And it's reminded me that, in South Africa, when they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they talked about different definitions of truth. They talked about a personal truth, things you believe to be true, a forensic truth, the things that science could prove, this notion of a official truth, a governmental media truth, and then a kind of community or healing truth, a truth that incorporated everything to take us forward. What we're yet to find is that kind of healing truth in this country, because we are so busy just dealing with the denial of our very, very long history. When people say, let's say Australia Day, that it's always been there, and you go, no, it hasn't. We all remember 1994 when we said, we had to do it on the 26th of January. Some of you might be too young. But what it was whatever long weekend we could have at the end of January so we could finish off summer. These things are not long held, but they get held onto because we're fearful of something else. And I think the Australian character is a lot more adventurous and a lot more curious than we give it credit for. We are egalitarian at our core. We believe in the rights of others to have a good life, not just to protect our own. And these things are being eroded because of, I think, adopting alien kind of values. It's interesting, in the United States, they have 3 days. Columbus Day, like Columbus ever went to North America. Anyway, that's another story. Columbus Day, Thanksgiving, and Independence Day. And they ask each of those days to play a different role in their society. What we try to do is go, why don't we just do it all on the same day, and that'll be the 26th of January because that was significant. We don't actually know why we're doing it. So we deny the conversation because of the fear. And what we need to do is actually make sure that we feel confident enough. And unfortunately, a confident and positive and hopeful society is not very easy to govern. So the more fearful we are, the more divided we get, the more split and angry we are at each other, the easier we are to govern, not just by our elected representatives, but by the businesses that thrive off our fear. So for me, the biggest vision, the most hopeful thing, and maybe it's transgressive in this day, is to have this overwhelming optimism that we are actually stronger together than we are pulled apart.
So happiness is a subversive act.
Yes, happiness is subversive. Be happy. I dare you.
What about you, John? What are your thoughts when you think of sort of a vision for Australia, a kind of country?
Yeah, look,
you
I mean,
want?
when you think about your kids and then grandkids and the future for the children of this country, and it has potential to be such a rich future. But that means to be equitable, just, where all of our people can join hands and walk together to this promised land, so to speak. And I think Wesley's touched on that. The fear today, and it is fear, this global drum-banging, fierce nationalism that is rampant across the globe at this particular moment. What we need in this country is leadership to not act like sheep, but to be brave and do things differently. And so this is what this country needs to do. And I said that is all about being inclusive. And I think for us that is also being about inclusive on probably the richest treasure the country holds, which is 65,000 years of Indigenous cultural connection to this place, and really incorporating that and making that a part of this very diverse country as it is today. And I said the potential is there, but we need brave people at the top to take that particular step to have this wonderful future and opportunity. Yeah.
And Rachel, visions for Australia, the kind of country you want it to be, as the outed optimist on the panel.
I'm not really. I mean, this whole thing. I mean, I'm trying to be positive, but can I say that we are getting the crumbs off the table in this situation? You talk about the 6 million. Well, then there's the 46 million for the statue thing that's going to be put over at Kurnell. And, we got, 2 million to try and repatriate some stuff at IATSIS out of that. And, I don't want to moan about it, but we still get the crumbs off the table in Australia, and we still are treated with a total lack of respect in terms of our governance and our right to have a view about policies that affect us, I think. And can I say that the last decade has been the most disrespectful experience that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of governments growing up as a girl to this point. And we need change, in that situation. So what do I want? I want a country that, that embraces all of the things you guys have said, that puts Indigenous culture, as you just said actually, which I thought I tried not to say, it's very funny, he said, it's a donut and we're going to fill the hole in the donut. Something like that, less mushy. There's so many things that we require. It's such a big question to answer. We need Indigenous languages properly funded, and we need cultural resurgence. We need proper land rights. We need decent health in our, communities. We need, and basic fundamental respect for us as a people, which has been lacking. So,
and is it too much to want for it all?
How do we get that? Yeah. I think some of the Indigenous leadership are forging ahead to try and pursue that, and that gives me great hope. You look at, on both sides of politics, people like Ken Wyatt, Linda Burney, Patrick, Malandiri, they're showing great leadership, so that gives me hope. But things have to change, and Indigenous people can't stay positive forever. We've been asking for this sort of stuff for 30, 50 years.
Longer.
No, just the structural reforms.
Yeah. There is
90 odd years.
Well,
Or probably going back to the
231.
beginning.
how do you want to encapsulate it? These sorts of structural reforms that we keep repeating over and over again.
There is a couple of questions that have come through on the Twitter stream that I guess I'd be interested to ask all of you if you've got a view about them. And that's the connection between the narratives, the storytelling, the symbolic actions, preamble, and then the actual concrete things, the money for health, the suicide prevention, education. What is the connection between the two? Do we get distracted by one, or do you actually see a profound link between them? And if you do, what are those links? Maybe start with you, Wesley?
Yeah, I guess the argument is, if you follow that argument all the way through to its natural conclusion, you would never spend money on any art, because health is always so important. And often I think that there are issues which are, yes, symptomatic of a much stronger, bigger disease, and culture, I think in a lot of Indigenous experiences, is is the thing that you have to make stronger to help deal with all the other things. There are cultural solutions to some of these goals. And it's interesting, the whole closing the gap conversation, which is in fact an extension of the deficit narrative. You don't have this, so therefore we'll give you this to make you more like us. When in fact you should say, what is the solution at the heart of it that is a cultural solution? How would you deal with these topics rather than saying, we'll do this to you? And I don't want to say that health isn't important, but I think also the cultural and the storytelling is also important. And just taking this thing about Cook, there's a chance for us to wrestle this narrative to one about navigation, to one about science, to say he wasn't the first boat and nor was he the last boat to arrive here. And we relate to boats in a very different way. Why? Why is there this deep psychological issue around arriving on these shores on a boat?
Yeah. And that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Geoffrey Blaney said that thing about boats, and that's interesting coming from Geoffrey Blaney, but the greatest maritime achievement known to humankind was Aboriginal people getting to these shores over 60,000 years ago. Navigating across in regards to that. So that is,
But the idea that the Cook narrative could be one about science.
Yeah.
It could be one about arrival and connection. And there are opportunities within the Cook narrative. We cannot deny the fact that Cook arrived here in 1770. That's fact, that's done. But what we can do is say, how is that useful to us as modern Australians? And we as storytellers and you as Australians, how do we say, we want this narrative to be the dominant narrative here?
But how, I guess then my question around that in changing narrative, which I agree with, is then why do we keep his name at the centre of it? Like why can't we talk about navigation? Why can't we talk about, why can't we also talk about other Aboriginal, Malaysian, Macassan, Indonesian explorers? Why aren't their names being talked about when we're talking about, if we want, there's so many different narratives. And if we want to talk about explorers, then maybe we should talk about the people that we were trading with in Australia very quite peacefully, exchanging language, games, spices, etc., in different parts of the country for many, many years.
Let's do it. Let's start calling it the Great Endeavour.
I don't know if it's safe.
Not Cook anymore at all.
Thinking out loud. Rachel, do you have any thoughts about the link between storytelling and then actual change on the ground?
Yes, well, people always criticise. They say, that's just symbolism. But the truth is that Indigenous people and our supporters are working at the national symbolic level, but we're also working at the ground level and in a very detailed way. So you can actually do both things, and I think both are important because both serve different functions. Because we need to move the Australian population, we need to educate them, because all of us were ripped off in our education. We learnt very little about our country's deep past or the culture. So we need to educate the country and move them nationally towards our support, and we need to then improve the lives of our people, at I won't say grassroots, but at that community level. So we can do both, I think, and if we have the support and the purse strings open and the commitment to do it, that is possible. And we have seen it in other countries. We know that it's possible. We have seen it in Canada to some extent. We've seen it in Aotearoa to some degree. We know that we've seen it in South Africa, we know that countries can reconcile their past and get a truth and acknowledge a truth. And we have struggled to do that in this country, but we have models. And so we need to look to these national opportunities as leverage to do so.
John, there was a question that came through that I'm going to direct to you, because it was about the extent to which I guess what became known as the history wars, the white blindfold, black armband views of history that became really part of the conversation during the Howard era is still the state of play. Have we moved on from that, or is this Cook anniversary another opportunity to see that divisiveness occur?
Erupt again? I
Erupt again?
certainly hope not. I think we have moved on, and I think we've certainly started a process of looking at a more shared approach to history, and that's inclusive of Indigenous and non-Indigenous historians working together in regards to that, to these stories. Stories have always been important to us. And I mean, and as I've mentioned before, and others have mentioned, and we were deprived of history for so long. So it's critically important for us, and that's my role. I mean, I speak to a lot of our people at grassroots level, and certainly kids in regards to that, the importance of them having heroes and heroines of their own, which we never had in the past. We weren't in that particular space. But I think certainly we've come through that rough patch. I mean, you look back, and that's been touched on. You look at the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That was an exciting time period. There was a mobilisation, not just of Aboriginal people, but incredibly non-Indigenous support for us at so many different levels. And you looked at the change of history actually impacting through the 70s, and there were so many people like Henry Reynolds and Anne Curtois and Peter Reid and many others, non-Indigenous historians who stepped into that space, certainly encouraged by people like Stanner and the boy Aletcher back in 67. And there was a change for us to come into that space and actually tell our narrative and our stories. And I think there was a dip, and certainly basically we ran into a brick wall at one point, but I think we've broke through that wall. I mean, even the Berlin Wall come down, and we've come out the other side of that now. And I think there is an opportunity to present that great shared narrative of this place, and that's not just what happened since 1788, but is inclusive of 65,000 years of history. And that's the important narrative that has to be told.
Wesley, there was also a question that was wondering if anyone on the panellists, but I'll start with you because you did mention it specifically, had any thoughts or reflections about why the telling of counter-narratives is met with fear? Why is fear the reaction to that?
I think that the nature of all power sharing is that people have to let go of some power for others to have power. I mean, we've seen it in the feminist movement very clearly, and if we are saying that there is going to be a power sharing into the future, not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but also for those who come to these shores more recently. When 42% of all Australians are either born overseas or have a parent born overseas, you start to realise that there's a lot of arrival going on in the last few decades or maybe 50 years. So power sharing is, by its very nature, an analysis of how much power you have, how much power someone else doesn't have, and how you might have to forego it. So no wonder people feel fearful. I mean, but also when other things are being taken away from them. If the coal mines and people who are making livings out of coal mines and feeding their children and buying houses and buying investment properties and buying the third car, but that kind of world might not be sustainable. So we have to let go of certain things. Now, I think it's the role of leadership, both I think artistic and cultural leadership, to say it's okay, it's all right, nothing's really going to go away. Don't be fearful of this change. And the counter-narratives which are progressive, scare people. So the more we get up there and go, okay, yeah, you may not have everything that you used to have, but in fact, if you think back to your great-grandparents and go, how did they live? What was the meat and 3 veg on the table? What was never owning a house really like? What was actually building your own home like? What was a sustainable world looking like? What did it mean to go to bed at sunset and get up at sunrise? All these things that are built into us in our DNA. They're not that long ago, and we should remember them in a very clear way. And so for me, I guess the fear of a counter-narrative is it's not my worldview, it's not what feeds me. Instead of creating a world of compassion and empathy to say, I can see the world from your point of view now, and I'm happy to share in the rewards, power, whatever that might be. Now, this is me being, offensively optimistic. But I think that's something I need to be as well.
But then I would say, what are you willing to surrender, and how much are you willing to work on cultivating something else?
Yeah.
So what are you willing to give up, but what are you by giving that up, how could you support something? How can you grow something, from that?
There was another question that came through the Twitter feed that in some ways provokes that in a very positive way, and it asks, how can non-Indigenous people be allies for Indigenous people? So, Rachel, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, already we've seen such great examples of non-Indigenous people being our allies, I mean, my mother's non-Indigenous and she's been an ally for her, since she was 21. Which is a long time ago. Sorry, Mum. So I think, in practical terms, I think it's good to get across the issues in complex, in its depth. So get across the aspirations that people are talking about. So read, inform yourself, and talk to your network. That's the sort of bigger sort of influencer. Be an influencer. I think, in your families, in your social situations, influence and inform. I think that's a really powerful tool because word of mouth and relationships are the things that change countries in some ways. And then there's so many practical ways, of course, to support, and there's, lots of ways you can do that. But I think be informed and use your influence is a really important thing that's often underestimated that you can do as an individual.
John?
Yeah, I think it's important to look to the past for that, and my mother's also non-Indigenous, and my wife's non-Indigenous.
Shout out to the mums. Shout out to the mums.
We've got some great women there in the support. But for me, looking to history, Rachel's dad and those non-Indigenous students who were on that bus in 1965, and when you look at the Gurindji walk-off at Wave Hill in 1966 with the incredible trade union support at that particular point in time, the 67 referendum with only 92% of this population voting to support us, and of course the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in 1972. There were a lot of non-Indigenous students at that rally, at that important moment in Aboriginal history. So we've had these incredible moments, these incredible people in our past who have stood up and been prepared to walk with us and speak out. And we need to mobilise people again, and we want their support. So the goes out, stand up.
I think Anne Curthoys is in the audience, so if you're sitting near her, give her a hug, because she's been mentioned a couple of times for her good works.
They're there.
Yeah. Amrita, what's your advice for non-Indigenous Australians on how they can be good allies?
I guess it's do the research. I was actually in a conversation around this time of year on Facebook or via text messages. I get about 25 messages from people that I haven't spoken to that much during the year that are like, hey, so what are some sites for Aboriginal people that are really important to Aboriginal people? And what are these? Like, maybe it's just really actively thinking before you're just asking the question. Though I do encourage a dialogue, and I will try and answer as many questions as possible. I'm not always, and also too, the other thing as well is that sometimes I'm not realize that we're not across everything all the time, always, of what's happening everywhere in the country. As an Aboriginal person, we are not necessarily the guidebook. I feel like now I'm talking about what not to do rather than what to do, because I feel like everybody here has been really generous about congratulating our allies, which are very, very important. Really active listening and thinking about where you could maybe volunteer your time. If somebody is running a rally, how could you be a marshal? How could you, because usually and there's been a lot of people talking about this at the moment, people that are organising rallies, they need help. They need help and support from people. And so maybe get involved before the day and before these specific days, like months in advance. Hell, you could set up a transfer of $4 a week or PayPal certain organisations. That would be another very small, amazing way to help people, such as potentially warriors of the Aboriginal resistance. There's a few others. I think that's what I can think of off the top of my head right now.
There's some good lists, Wesley.
I'm just thinking that often our allies have access to conversations that we will never be allowed into. That might be that people hold their attitudes close when there's an Aboriginal person in the room. They may not express their deepest held views unless they feel that they're not going to be jumped on. So the idea that if all the white ears in the country were listening to moments and then found that they could say, oh, I actually disagree with you on something, and actually engage in a very, very positive conversation about something that's been said. So someone says basically a racist remark, all Aboriginal people get free cars, Actually just go,
It's
well,
true.
that's... No.
I want mine.
But that sense of saying, engage. That often we're quite passive in our support because it actually means putting yourself out there. Actually, there's this great story. The chicken and the pig go for breakfast, and the chicken says to the pig, "Oh, I'll order. Let's have bacon and eggs." And the pig says, I'll have breakfast with you because we should bond and we should be together, but just realise that we have a different relationship to this breakfast. For you, it's a contribution, and for me, it's a sacrifice.
Yeah.
So I reckon stop being chickens and make a contribution.
Although, can I counter that
Please.
and say also, it's our responsibility. The challenge is for us as Indigenous people to galvanise the overwhelming support that exists for Indigenous people in this country and animate that support for political change. That is our challenge, I think. And it's what they did so well in 67, across Christians, communists, Wharfies, conservatives, etc. That's our challenge, I think.
Agreed.
Well, and we have to start winding up now. Wesley has to leave to cycle, very environmentally friendly, cycling down to the Opera House for another event. But I think we've learnt some really great insights. I'll never look at bacon and eggs the same again without some deep reflection. I've also learnt that we can't have reconciliation without a lot of donuts, and that being happy is a great act of subversion. But I also think we might have taken away the fact that it is about time for a treaty, or Rachel is going to lose her optimism. I've never heard a better argument.
Well, here.
The time is now. So I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Take some time to do the survey. A big thanks to the team at UTS and Sydney Festival for all the behind-the-scenes work. A shout out to Kylie and Nat from Auslan for their great work today. Thank you, yay. And thank you all, everyone, for being here for this amazing event. And I hope you still enjoy Sydney Festival. Quickly, Wesley, what can people do over this last weekend?
There's the vigil tonight. There's a ferry race tomorrow. There's Man with the Iron Neck. There's Beware of Pity. There's One Infinity. There's go down to the Spiegel tent in Hyde Park. There's Gâteau Chocolat doing a fantastic show as well as Pagal. A lot of it's still sold out, but try. Just try.
And Amrita's exhibition.
Oh, Amrita's exhibition. Lots of fantastic work.
At Cement Fondue
in
Paddington.
Across, still the visual arts program happening throughout for the next couple of days, if not going a bit further.
Great. So there's lots to do while you're being subversively optimistic and happy. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you,
let's
Larissa.
one more time to thank our
Larissa.
panel. Wesley Enoch, Amrita Hepi, Rachel Perkins and John Maynard.
And Larissa Behrendt.
Yeah.